We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today. Good morning, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. Delighted to welcome Ben Jacobs back to the show. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning, how are you?
Very good, mate, very good. My blood pressure has dropped since last night's Three Amigos, where I was ranting like only a Wraith can about the week that we've just had. That was the week that was when newspaper headlines, online headlines, whatever you want to call them, went into overdrive about our club. And we've seen within the last 3 or 4 days links to Joe Linton, Kieran Trippier, Bruno Guimaraes, Alexander Isak, all head out of the club. And I laid the blame a little bit at our chief executive's door, at Darren Eales, for the interview that he put out a couple of weeks ago, where he said that we may have to sell players. That's been taken out of context by quite a lot of our fans on social media, where they've come out and said star player. Somebody's added star to it. You listen to the interview, he doesn't say star player. He's explaining how financial fair play works and how Newcastle are hindered by the financial fair play rules and regs. But since then, we've seen, Joe Linton, whose season potentially could be over. Looks like he will go for surgery this week. Then a story put out there to suggest that could be the last game he's played. And then, the PSG links and talk of Barcelona and Real Madrid bidding for Bruno or Isak, 2 of our best players, if not our best players. And then the Bayern Munich story, which came from, left side yesterday. And then gathered momentum because, of course, Bayern Munich would say they're interested if they asked the question. So it's been a car crash of a week for me since that Darren Eales interview, and I was at my wit's end last night, and I had a proper rant on the show, and we've discussed it just before we came on. Had a minute or two just to talk about it, and a lot of people say, why don't you have more the other journalists on, etc.? Well, look, people move on, and I just enjoy Ben coming on because I think we'll get a straight answer. It might be a long answer, but we'll get a straight answer from Ben. And he doesn't have, although he's got an allegiance to Newcastle as his second club, if you like, because Leicester's his club. He can give a balanced view, and he did it about the takeover for me, and he continues to do it about journalism. So Ben, this week. You haven't had time to see the rant that I gave last night, but I was angry. I was angry, mate, and I'm still not happy about it. Give us your view about what you've seen this week with regards to Newcastle before we dig into some of these stories and get your opinion on what you think's going on.
Well, I think the starting point, as you say, was the interview from Darren Eales, and it can be risky, in my opinion, for anybody senior at a football club to speak during a January window because there's always a danger that it sets off a range of emotions. how do we read what Darren Eales said, specifically in relation, as you alluded to, these star names? Well, he was asked about Alexander Isak, Sven Botman and Bruno Guimaraes directly. And his response was yes, on any player. And he said any player, it depends on circumstances. But then he did speak more specifically. And what he said was, if we're offered 1 billion for any of those players, the three that I mentioned, no one could argue against that making sense. So is the headline, Newcastle will only sell their star names for a 1 billion offer? Or is the headline, Newcastle are open to selling their star names? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And I think that it is very easy to get a headline out of that. And I do think that it is very open, but perhaps not the right time for somebody so senior at the football club to be speaking when emotions are running high. The reality of the situation is that there's less than 2 weeks left of the window. Newcastle are still looking for some kind of European football through the league, potentially through the FA Cup. And it would be unthinkable for them to lose their star names in the next 10 days, because it's not only about selling for financial reasons, potentially, it's also about being able to replace. And the reality is that were Newcastle to entertain a sale for an Isak, for a Bruno, they could probably get the same number that they're looking for if they were either forced to or chose to, because they want to use that money elsewhere in the summer. So it doesn't feel like there has to be a fire sale. I think people are connecting dots along the lines of Newcastle are out the Champions League. That's money they're not going to get. But I can guarantee you financially, not in a football sense, financially, they wouldn't have budgeted for European football in the second half of the season. In the same way, I've said many times that the budget is going to be for mid-table. The budget is going to be for European football in the first half of the season. You don't project your budget too ambitiously. So the football aim would have been absolutely get out the group. And they haven't met that, but it was a really difficult group. But the budgetary aim would not have been European football for the entire season, because that's too risky and ambitious. You can't do your budgets on that. So January was always going to be conservative. And then you get a welcome bonus if you're still in the Champions League, and maybe you're able to move a bit more freely. So I think the reality is that Newcastle are quite calm behind the scenes. It's absolutely true that if the right offer comes in for a player, depending on circumstances, they will consider it. But that doesn't mean that it definitely will be today or tomorrow. But I think the mistake that Darren Eales made, potentially, is he's put out there publicly in a window in the market that Newcastle's financial position may force them to trade certain names. And Eddie Howe's done the same. He's spoken about FFP. He's spoken about constrictions within the market. And whether true or not to the penny within the context of this window, the entire market feels like there's a window of opportunity with Newcastle. So somebody might try their luck. The buy-in interest in Kieran Trippier is genuine. But I think that with 10 days left of the window, it would be unthinkable that Newcastle would sanction that kind of sale, because they can wait until the summer and a couple of wins and they probably find themselves somewhere close to 6th place again. And then you're thinking Europa League football, we're in a stronger position. So it's a key few games of the season, I think, not just in football terms, but financially as they look to plan to the summer. And it can be true that Newcastle are not just going to allow these fire sales or this exodus. But come summer, one of the big names might go. And that might be down to finances. That might be down to where they finish in the league. It might be down to a release clause. And guess what? That's virtually every single club on the planet in this context. And that's where Newcastle, in my opinion, are maybe victims of their own success. Because had Newcastle last season finished 7th or 8th and got Europa Conference League, then the fans would have loved the away trips and they'd probably still be in the tournament. And then if they were 10th after 21 games, but again, not too far off Europa Conference League or Europa League, fans would feel that they've kind of stabilised. But the fact that they were so good last season means the bar's been raised. So now there's this perception of panic and having to firefight and being financially ruined somehow. And I just don't think that's the reality as of now. It might be in the summer. It might be in a season or two if they continue with this strategy and it does move backwards. But at the moment, I think that Newcastle are not in any pressured position to do anything that in the market they don't want to do, at least as far as outgoings are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, look, the links to some of the players this week have been tenuous, to say the least. And we've already established, this comes from what Darren Eales said subsequently, Eddie Howe, on the Friday press conference, saying that they were hampered by financial fair play. He did correct one of the journalists, I believe, when they mentioned star players, and he said, well, that wasn't the case. That's not what was said. But there is a release clause in Bruno's contract. Is that something that Newcastle fans should be worried about, Ben, long term?
Well, long term, there's a release clause. How often do you see release clauses paid, especially from English clubs? It can be a bit different in places like Portugal, that they can often be set below market value or somewhere close. Benjamin Sesko's another one to watch, obviously linked with Manchester United, some links with Newcastle, and that release clause is relatively low. I think it would be a bargain at about 50 million euros. But sometimes the payment terms, in fact, more often than not, the payment terms of a release clause are very preferable to the seller, which is why you try and do a deal around the release clause using that number for market valuation, but not necessarily triggering it. The other thing about a release clause is that it means nothing if you trigger it, and then the player also doesn't want to trigger it. So ultimately, Sergio Guirassy is an example. That release clause for the winter market has now expired. But when that release clause was active, a lot of people said, why don't Newcastle or Manchester United, the two clubs that had looked at him quite seriously, trigger the clause? But again, if the player indicates he wants to stay at Stuttgart, you're wasting your time triggering it. And then the player says, no, thanks, I don't want to move mid-season. I'm at the Africa Cup of Nations. I'll stay with Stuttgart. So Bruno, if someone came in today, I would imagine would say, no, thanks, I'll see out the season with Newcastle. That is my opinion. You could argue if it's Real Madrid and they're offering him 3 times the wages, but now we're really creating these fictional scenarios that are not financially feasible and not likely to happen. The other thing about Bruno is that the idea that PSG want him is sort of accurate in a dream world, but not in this window. So people are talking about how he went to Paris for personal reasons, how PSG want him this window, not true. How PSG have started talks, not true either to my knowledge. So again, Newcastle don't think that anything is imminent. And if somebody triggered the release clause for Bruno now, my feeling is that Bruno would not want to go. So I think that Newcastle can be calm. But ultimately, when you negotiate a new long-term contract and you put in that mechanism, and in the current market for 100 odd million, give or take, that I think is at his value. Maybe some suitors feel like they want to try and get 10, 50 million knocked off, but somewhere around 100 million, when you consider Declan Rice, when you consider Enzo Fernandes, when you consider Moises Caicedo, it's the reality of the modern market that he probably is a £100 million player. So if someone wants him, release clause or not, that's the number. And if they can use the release clause, it might catalyze an exit. But I think we're going to have to be patient and wait. Nobody can tell you at the moment whether he might consider an exit in the summer or 2025, largely because we don't know where Newcastle are going to be. And if Newcastle get any form of European football, I think he'll stay with the football club also in 2024, 2025. And then again, if they move forwards, what's the point in leaving? If they move backwards, it's a different scenario. And the longer the contract goes on, the more the price will drop and the less likely anyone is to even go for the release clause's valuation. So he becomes a bit of a bargain, financially speaking, because you're going to offer lower because there'll be a year and a half, 2 years less left on the contract as you move into 2025. So I think Newcastle are planning with Bruno in the long term. And I think that only their circumstances, football-wise and finances, may change that. But I don't think anything is going to happen in the next 10, 11 days, certainly not with PSG, because they've not made any approach. They've not held any talks with a view to this window. And having an interest is one thing, but escalating that to actually try and get the player is another. And I think PSG feel that the vast majority of their January business is done. But to be clear, because there were a lot of rumours about Bruno being in Paris, maybe that was a sign that Newcastle, off the back of Eales' comments, were going to have some sort of fire sale of a big star. There's been nothing at the time of recording in terms of an advance, an inquiry, an approach, anything, even something informal at this point for this window between PSG and Bruno Guimaraes, to my understanding anyway. If others say different, I obviously respect that, but that's not the information that I have.
Interesting that Newcastle fans feel that Darren Eales potentially may have played a blinder in the way that he brought financial fair play to the fore, because obviously Richard Masters this week announced as well that there's going to be a meeting about potentially looking at changing a few things around, Ben. What did you make of that?
Well, I think that Darren Eales didn't read the room and, in my opinion, shouldn't have done the interview, because anybody, CEO, sporting director, speaking in the middle of a window is playing a very, very dangerous game. As far as financial fair play is concerned, everybody's in the same boat. And it is really frustrating because, as I've said many times, if Newcastle gets success quickly, then the ambition becomes sky high, but the finances have to go slower due to the fact that it's only one season of Champions League, and Brighton are exactly the same. And clubs like West Ham, if they get into Europe, even though they actually won a trophy, are also in an identical position. And Leicester, my club, you win the Premier League, you get to the quarterfinals of a Champions League. And then there were these 2 seasons where Leicester, on the final day of each season, had Champions League football on a top 4 finish in their control. And they fell out of the top 4. And suddenly there was almost fan disappointment and outrage. And then the following seasons, it was a case of, why are we not strengthening? Why are we not spending? And then the season before Leicester went down, they finished in the top half and everyone was disappointed. And again, it was more about financial restrictions at the club, because they'd spent a lot of their money on a first-rate training centre, on the expansion of the King Power Stadium. And then they went down, and quite a large proportion of the Leicester fan base say, yikes, how did we not strengthen? How did we not spend? How did we not back the manager? How did we stick with Brendan Rodgers for so long? Why did we allow Wesley Fofana to go to Chelsea? These are all contributing factors we needed to spend so we could get into Europe. And you have to take a step back and think, the great escape under Nigel Pearson was only the season before Leicester won the Premier League. And when you move that fast, it's really difficult to stay within the rules. And I think that you could make a reward-based argument that when a club qualifies for European football, they get some extra leeways. They're playing more games. They need more depth. Is there anything within profit and sustainability that should be rewarding clubs and giving them a bigger leeway if they play in European football? But obviously the challenge there is that then you're creating an uneven playing field. You could say the same on the reverse end. If somebody comes up, then should they be given the full 105 million in allowed losses as opposed to it being ratioed in one season? Well, again, no, it's unfair because it's an uneven playing field, but it gives a newly promoted side maybe the ability to give themselves a better chance of staying in the Premier League. But if they don't and they go down, then they've got 3 years worth of losses instead of planning that singular year. And that can create financial ruin, even with a parachute payment. And this is the challenge with changing financial fair play. You're never going to please everybody. And I think financial fair play is not there to constrict. So people are looking at FFP as if Eddie Howe's disappointed, Newcastle are disappointed. They want to do something, but the rules don't allow it. The rules are not there to trip up Newcastle. The rules are not there to benefit the other big 6 clubs. If we're calling Newcastle now the 7th, the rules are there to make sure that financial ruin doesn't happen. And the reason for that is because Newcastle are not stable. Newcastle, if you look at the history, have gone from battling relegation to immediate Champions League and now back to mid-table. So the ownership may be stable, the project may be stable, but you can't say that they're stable in terms of their league positions because they've been in a horrific relegation battle where statistically everyone wrote them off, to Champions League qualification, to Champions League football, to mid-table at the moment, and who knows where they'll finish. And over those seasons, you have to accept, again, your financial planning needs to be conservative, and financial fair play and Premier League profit and sustainability is there to protect you. It just doesn't feel that way because it's dry, it's legal, it's budgetary, and everyone's watching the games, paying their hard-earned money and wanting a striker or wanting more depth and thinking that somehow the rules are stopping Newcastle. So change them. But I don't think it's the rules that need changing. I think it's every single club needs changing to adapt to the rules to become sustainable. And that might mean that you can't get all the best players in the world. That might mean that you can't pay most ridiculous wage brackets. And that's not fun for a fan to hear. But the reality is, what's the other option? The other option is that you spend. Everybody's really excited. And then you get a massive bill. If it was you with your credit card and I just said, you know what, screw it. You can have an unlimited limit, spend what you want for Christmas and the New Year, have the best time in the world. And you went, brilliant. And you did everything everything that you wanted, and then you woke up in 6 months' time and you were like, yikes, they've got hundreds of bills I can't pay. It was fun while it lasted, but now I'm going to spend the next however many years paying off a credit card because I never should have spent that amount. And it's exactly the same with football. So you can have a choice where you don't put those things on your credit card, or you don't spend if you're Newcastle. And of course, it's not as exciting in the short term. And of course, you also might go down the table, but that is the reality of budgets, and the same budgets that affect you and me to an extent should be affecting football clubs. The difference is football clubs can have revolving credit, football clubs can get bigger loans, football clubs can dine off debt, there's allowable losses. So they are allowed to put more, if you like, on their credit card, but it shouldn't be seen as unlimited, and it shouldn't be forced by front-facing incomings just because there's pressure from fans and the media to actually buy. You have to ultimately say the rules are not there to trip anybody up. So if you're going to change them, you're not changing them to allow Newcastle and others more leeway. You're changing them to protect the clubs, to make sure they're sustainable. Otherwise, what if we get in a scenario where PIF leave one day and Newcastle have spent, and it's really exciting because we know PIF have got money, even if they can't directly spend it on Newcastle because of their financial situation. What if they leave one day and somebody else comes in and they inherit financial ruin, and then in 10, 15, 20 years, Newcastle fall all the way out of the Premier League to God knows where? And we've seen so many clubs with that cautionary tale, and some of them have gone out of business. Some of them have done a Leeds where they spent extortionately and they went all the way to League One. Newcastle have obviously flown high under Kevin Keegan and ended up relegated. So these cautionary tales are there, and the risk is because the market is so inflated, you have to spend so much now to get the player or players you want, which means the risk is even higher. Because 15 years ago, if you gave Newcastle 100 million, you'd be delighted with that. You'd bring in 4 players, 4 good players. Now 100 million might only get you 1 player. And the danger is if you spend 3 players and 300 million and it doesn't work, a club like Newcastle could be in big, big trouble. So they have to be responsible by necessity. And I actually welcome the rules. I know that they're restrictive. I know they're frustrating because it feels like some clubs benefit and some don't. And maybe the medium and smaller clubs in the Premier League are more affected by them, whereas the bigger clubs get away with more. And that is a reality of the fact that there is an unevenness and there's a difference in structure. And the multi-club model is going to allow bigger clubs more freedom. But ultimately, you also don't want your club to go bust. And we have to think longer term than just today, tomorrow. Because the window's open, there's need now. I still think that football fans have to understand that there's a longer term need for sustainability. And I think clubs have a responsibility as well to be transparent about that.
I think it's an interesting time, though, for Richard Masters to speak out about the profit and sustainability, because at the moment, top flight clubs can make losses of up to 105 million over a 3-year period, Ben. But the rules are different to UEFA's. So basically, that limits spending on wages, transfers, agent fees to 70% of their revenue in 25-26. And Newcastle have been working to both sets of rules. But the senior figures who are behind the scenes believe it's going to make sense for the Premier League to match up. So it's interesting that there's now going to be this meeting in February to potentially change the rule. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they're doing that?
Well, I think the Premier League are pushing because they want to show that they can self-regulate. And that includes financially speaking as well, because there's a government regulator incoming. And when that happens, it's a threat to the Premier League's power. So they're trying, because despite what they may say, which is sort of sitting on the fence a little bit, they're ultimately against independent regulation. It might be right for English football, but it's definitely not perfect for the Premier League. So I think the Premier League are pushing to show that they can regulate and push for as many rules that they want early, potentially before the regulator comes into full force. That's one theory. The other thing is just, as you say, it's not just fees for transfers and therefore player valuations, it is also agents' fees and wages. So you can make an argument that if you want a level playing field, the league could put a wage cap or the league could put an agent fee cap. And we know that there's a big ongoing case at the moment where FIFA and UEFA are trying to curb agent fees, but they've been unsuccessful so far. And that case rumbles on. And naturally, if there's a cap on agent fees, if there's a cap on wages, then it puts everybody on a level playing field. But you're going to get outrage from players and players' unions because maybe those that are on 350,000 at some of the big clubs won't be able to sustain that type of income. And the other thing, therefore, is if you move in that area, you might skew the market, because unless it's universal, what about Saudi Arabia or another new player? Imagine if you said to Bruno Guimaraes, we've just offered you a new contract, let's call it 150,000 a week. Suddenly you go to renew and you say, due to the wage cap, we have to bring that down to 120. And Bruno says, well, the next renewal, if I'm going to stay, should be 220,000. And then Saudi come and say, have 400,000 tax free. There's a danger. And again, you can't cap an agent fee in one league. And that's been the big argument here. So when the FIFA agent cap, which they want to be universal, was challenged initially in a court in Germany and then more recently in the UK, FIFA had to suspend it whilst they appeal against the injunction, because they know that they can't implement something in one country and not in another. Otherwise, the agents are going to start pushing their players to the countries where they can make the most money. It's common sense. If a player's torn between Newcastle and Milan and the agent can get an unlimited cap commission on the Italy deal and not in England, then it's going to be a factor potentially in where they want to negotiate and do business. So it's really complicated, because any rule changes and any Premier League push to some extent has to have a universality about it. Otherwise, it's never going to get pushed through. And I think the Premier League are torn because they want to be their own entity. They want to be ultimately those that run the league, oversee the governance, oversee the judicial side, oversee the financial side. They want to be everything. They want to be the regulator, and they want to be the all-encompassing power that takes decisions. And sometimes, as we're seeing with Manchester City, Everton and Forest, they have to make referrals on the judicial side to independent panels, but generally they want full control. And then anything they do, if it sets a precedent, if it isn't effectively football-wide, may not get pushed through. And if it does get pushed through, it will still need UEFA and FIFA backing. And it's challenging because, again, it's all within football. But I sense the Premier League are moving in these areas to show a robustness. Otherwise, there's a danger that the independent regulator comes in and decides to do it a different way. And then the Premier League's position of power and control will be weakened. And that's why I think we're seeing so much movement at the moment and so much chat and quite a lot of transparency about how rules either are changing or might change in the future.
Yeah, it's certainly one that's going to run and run. Lots of comments coming in, some agreeing with Ben, some disagreeing with Ben, but it's such a complicated thing. Derek says, the one thing I don't like is the top six can take the lower team players by offering better wages, which will make it harder to get there. Ian says the EPL are in danger of becoming a victim of their own device. You can spend to attract the top players. No attraction means no interest in the Premier League. No interest means no income into the Premier League. Ian McKenna says, here's the thing, though, without FFP, there's not a club on the planet could compete with PIF. It would obliterate any competition. And these rules are killing football, says Geordie Toomberlife. The Premier League can't see the wood for the trees. Just look at how much business is being done in the transfer market, and it's affecting all clubs, including Europe. So, yeah, lots of messages, lots of opinions coming as we get halfway through the show. We will do the ads and we will be back after this. A big thanks to all our sponsors. Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3. Email inquiries at skipsandbins.com. Website skipsandbins.com. Easy contract, free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks again to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. If you'd like to order some, then give them a call on 01768 210 102. Go to the website, mrvickies.co.uk, or drop them an email, info@mrvickies.co.uk. A big thanks to United Group Travel. They're a family firm based in Morpeth with pickups throughout the Northeast. No strangers on our tours, just people you haven't met yet. They've got a presence on Facebook and a website, unitedgrouptravel.com. If you want to make a booking, give them a call on 01670 632 460 or mobiles 0791 666 4174 0795 71 41654. Thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals, independent funeral directors. Let us look after you in your time of need. They're based on Old Durham Road in Gateshead, and you can contact them at their website, darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Email Darren at darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk, or give them a call, 0191 478 2730. A big thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the technical side of things. And a big thanks to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. If you want to help the channel, hit the thumb up to subscribe, hit the subscribe button, and share to your other social media. You can also pay a one-off fee of £25 to get a scarf, a cup, a pen, and a membership card. Go to the website, nufcmatters.com, and click membership, or put your smartphone over this QR code. We also support the food bank on this channel. If you want to make some donations virtually, go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and make a donation today. We're also a podcast on Spotify, iTunes, and other podcast providers. Just search NUFC Matters. I'm also a part of the Northeast Footy Brekkie Show. You can listen to that Monday to Friday, 7 till 9 at thetoonuk.com. Okay, welcome back to NUFC Matters. I do have some sad news to break to the NUFC Matters community, and that is one of our own, Steve Wilkinson, who many of you know from watching the podcast over the years on Geordie's Here, Geordie's There. A good friend of mine, part of the fans liaison committee all those years ago, 2 decades ago now, and a very operative fan with Newcastle United Disabled Supporters Association over the years, has passed away this morning at 5 o'clock after a battle against cancer. Sad to hear this news. Just been literally contacted about 5 minutes ago by his good lady. But Steve was somebody who stood up for everything that he believed in. Was a big Newcastle fan, and our heart goes out to his family this morning. Sad news, Ben.
Very sad news. And again, my thoughts, as you say, with his family and his friends. I know he was a big advocate within the community and naturally a huge Newcastle fan as well. So hopefully the fan base can do something at the next home game to pay their respects. But as you say, my thoughts and my prayers are with his friends and family, and he'll be sorely missed.
Okay, Steve, this episode we'll dedicate to his memory. I'm sure there'll be a lot more chat about Steve this week, and a few people in the chat. I can see messages coming in already. We are going to talk transfers and see whether there's any substance in anything that we've seen in the papers this week with Ben for the last half hour. Ben, Calvin Phillips. Let's start with Calvin Phillips. It's a name linked with Newcastle for so long now, but looks like Newcastle are going to miss out on that. Whether they were ever fully interested in it, I'm not 100% sure, but the £7 million loan fee and the wages seem to be the sticking point with this one, and looks like we've missed the boat, and Crystal Palace could be his destination.
Yeah, I think with Calvin Phillips, the Newcastle advancement was a little bit overblown. There was a feeling within the club that they were quite optimistic if, and that's the key word, they chose to move because they believed that they could give Phillips the minutes that he needed. Now, I've pushed back on that, actually, despite the sources who have indicated that, because I don't think the 4-3-3 suits Phillips when you consider that as long as you've got fit strikers, there's always a chance Joe Linton drops into midfield with Bruno. There's only one more spot. Calvin Phillips could take that spot, of course, but you've got Lewis Miley, you've got Elliot Anderson, you've got Sean Longstaff. So there's no guarantee. And Phillips needs to play every week. And that's where potentially Palace or West Ham United or even a foreign club could emerge as an option. But the thing to understand is that for the last maybe 2 windows, Newcastle have had Phillips on their radar. And I was one of the first to report that. But in this window, I've kind of taken a bit of a step back from pushing it in my reporting, because Juventus in the early part of the window were the only club that approached Manchester City formally. Now there's 3 or 4 that are in talks with them. So a solution will be found. But Newcastle haven't and hadn't open talks in any advanced or formal sense. Of course, you're across it and they can never be discounted. But a few weeks ago, there were a lot of reports flying around saying Newcastle were in talks, Newcastle were the front runners, Newcastle would do it as long as they don't have to pay an obligation. And none of that was accurate to my understanding. Newcastle hadn't started talks at that point, and Manchester City are not necessarily hell-bent on an obligation. So it doesn't look like Newcastle are favourites. Of course, they could react if they think another club are close. But at the moment, there's other teams that are further along. Palace are one, because as you say, Roy Hodgson has said very clearly that he would like to be in the mix, and West Ham are one to watch. And I still wouldn't discount a last-minute push from one of the foreign suitors that have looked at Calvin Phillips. Juventus seem to have ruled it out. Atletico Madrid are also in the conversation. And there's some talk about Barcelona as well, but I don't think that they're front runners either. But at the moment, Newcastle are not front of queue for Phillips. And they may never have been front of queue for Phillips. They may have been front of queue in the sense that their interest has been more long-standing. And they may be front of queue in the sense of internally, they were talking about him very seriously before others. But as soon as this window opened, I think they fell back. And I don't think they've ever caught up. We'll wait and see whether that changes in the next few days. But I don't think that Calvin Phillips to Newcastle is as advanced at this stage as maybe has been implied throughout the January window to date.
Lots of people talking about Onana in the chat. What have you heard about this one, Ben?
Only that Everton want to keep on to the player. I think that Newcastle have a genuine interest, but there's no cut price sale, not in January anyway. And Onana and Arsenal might be one to watch in the summer. But it's challenging because this is an Everton team that are thinking in the context of their points deduction, even if they win the appeal, that they have to keep their players and try and stave off relegation and then reconsider the situation in the summer. And if you're a suitor, you might wait until the summer, see what division they're in. It's the same with Ivan Toney. If Brentford were to go down, then the Toney deal looks a lot different. And this is why when people sort of say to journalists, why are you sitting on the fence? Well, there's too many variables to be making predictions. And Arsenal to Newcastle's not going to happen in this window. And by the summer, we have to understand what division Everton are in and who else also comes into the race, because it might be Arsenal. I think Arsenal want Zubimendi and Douglas Luiz. That's their 1 and 2. But Onana's probably there as a close third or a joint second, whatever you want to call it. Like Zubimendi's a younger player, so they'll probably try for a Zubimendi and one other, and that might be Onana, that might be Luiz. So then who's got Champions League football? Who's offering higher wages? What division are Everton in? Too many variables. But the Newcastle interest is genuine on this one. It could be one to watch. And again, people say, well, Everton are going to have to sell. And that might be true to an extent. But remember, Newcastle are in the same kind of financial boat where even if Everton are prepared to knock down the price a little bit, Newcastle have still got to find that money. And that might be a challenge. And the money that people are talking about, I think, is being downplayed and undervalued based on Everton's financial situation. I'm told by sources that Onana is 50, 55, 60 million, that kind of ballpark, not 45, not 50 with add-ons, not 40 plus bonuses, 50 up to 60, 65. So that's a lot of money. And I think that's fair in the current climate when you look at other midfielders. But I don't see Newcastle paying that. So I think it's going to be quite challenging, genuine interest, but they might need an outgoing first to facilitate that, or they might need European football before they can move, which is why I don't see it happening overnight. I don't see Everton really agreeing to a loan with an option or an obligation, and I don't think Newcastle could commit to a loan with an obligation. And the last thing I would say in terms of the valuation with Onana, which is important, is when they bought Onana from Lille, 33 million was the price. So this is why they're not going to be looking at 40, 45 million. They're going to want to make about 20 odd million more than they paid for the player if they're to consider a sale in 2024. And that means the price might end up out of Newcastle's budget, but we'll have to wait and see, because come summer, a lot of things can change. And one of those is obviously, as I've said many times, Newcastle qualifying for European football.
Edison, another one linked this week, Ben, a Brazilian, of course, somebody who is plying his trade at Atlanta at the moment. And from my perspective, not a bad player. Had a rich vein of form this season. Would Newcastle look towards that kind of avenue this month, or do you think that's more of a summer signing?
Again, I think price is quite difficult here unless they can get themselves a loan with an option to buy. And sometimes some of the Serie A clubs are prepared to do that. So if Phillips is too expensive for Newcastle, and I know you have to factor in higher wages than Edison as well, but I would say Edison is exactly the same thing. Atlanta were able to do great business for Rasmus Højlund, and they'll be pushing that number up and up and up for any Premier League suitors. And I don't think the player has helped Newcastle or any other club by saying there's lots of people looking at me, because that suggests that there's interest and Atlanta will wait for a bidding war. I'd be staggered unless they decide mid-season loan if anything's possible in January. I think the minimum price that you would get, talking sources in Italy, is 50 million euros, which is about 42 million quid. But by that, I mean minimum. And there will be bonuses on top of that. So the total package for the player is going to, I think, be 60 million euros or above, which is over 50 million pounds. And again, not sounding like a broken record here, but listen to what Eddie Howe says, listen to what Darren Eales says. Newcastle don't have that kind of money. So unless they can find a structure in the short term, this is again one to pick up during the summer period. The interest also is there from Liverpool, to my knowledge as well. So there's a few Premier League clubs and top European clubs who are tracking the player. And the other thing is that I think he wants to play European football. So again, Newcastle are in a slightly awkward position here because they want a window plan and they want to look for the summer. And they obviously do have a player like this on their radar, but there's too many things that need to be clarified before the player himself would make up his mind. And to give you sort of a broader bit of context, which I think often gets forgotten, people look at the club perspective with a transfer. And if you're a fan of that club, you think, well, what will Newcastle do? Have Newcastle got the money? How well will he be with other players in our midfield? But sometimes we forget the player. And it's not just about where the player wants to go. It's about when the player wants to move. And a lot of players don't want to go mid-season because there's no pre-season. They don't want to go mid-season because they don't know what they're going to get next season either. And it's obviously different if you've got one club in mind and it's a box office move and you just know that it's right for your career. And that's why Moises Caicedo wanted to originally leave in mid-season, not in the summer, because he just knew that he wanted to make the move and he thought that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But you can understand why an Edison, in the context of Newcastle, if we're talking more broadly, a Victor Osimhen, why they're going to rush just because your club decides to make a move. They're going to say, summer's better for a move. Summer, I know what you've got next season. Summer, if you've got Champions League football, I can ask for more money in that season. Summer, I can move with my family. Summer, I can get to know my teammates. Summer, I can wait and see what other clubs have got. Summer, I've got more leverage because there'll be other suitors. And summer, I can take my time because it's a 3-month window. And this is ultimately why January is a seller's market if the right clubs come calling, but not really a buyer's market. And I think you have to look at a transfer like Edison and Newcastle from the perspective of the player. And I would be really, really surprised if Newcastle could find the finances or persuade the player to move mid-season when he knows that Liverpool are not going to move in January. They're going to move in the summer should they decide that he's somebody they want. So I think this is, again, one to wait for the summer. And it sounds boring because my answer to every single question for Newcastle is wait and see until the summer. But that's the reality. They can't really move this aggressively in January. And by summer, their entire window will be impacted on whether they have European football.
Lots of outgoings rumoured. Manquillo, as we know, is a way to potentially have a reunion with Rafa Benitez, Celta Vigo. I think the deal seems to be almost over the line. There has been a few comments this morning about potentially a problem with the fee, but they would expect it to be ironed out. Lascelles linked with Pesquitas as well. Is this Newcastle perhaps trying to clear the decks a little bit now to bring somebody in this month?
Yeah, I think so. Although Jamal Lascelles' future is a little bit more unclear. As you say, the Manquillo deal is more advanced. But Besiktas had a historical interest in Lascelles that has kind of re-emerged. I was also told actually the other day that there's some Saudi interest in him now as well, particularly from Al Shabab. and maybe even Al Ittihad as well, the Saudi champions. But the counter to that from those close to the player is he's not looking to move to Saudi at this point. But naturally, if you go to Turkey versus Saudi, the Turkish standard is higher and you can still be playing in European football, but the Saudi money is more. So that's quite an interesting one, but I don't see it complicating the situation. The kind of aspect with Lascelles that is complicating some suitors that might come, particularly Saudi, is that Lascelles is out of contract in the summer. So a lot of clubs, including Besiktas, I'm told, and certainly in Saudi Arabia, are thinking more about pre-contract and then summer rather than moving now, which is not as cost effective. And I think that Newcastle's preference would obviously be, knowing that it doesn't look like there's going to be a renewal, to potentially get him out the door now. And naturally, why wouldn't you? If you don't need somebody imminently and you think he'll sign a pre-contract, why wouldn't you just wait and then sign the player in the summer? So that's the complicated situation with Lascelles, and we kind of have to work out whether Newcastle have got any control over it or whether someone's just going to go to the player side, get something lined up, and then he'll obviously stay until the end of the season and it will all be resolved in the summer.
You mentioned Saudi. Somebody in the chat earlier on mentioned Ian Hull. It was any loans from Saudi at all? Do you think, for example, Mitrovic? Now, this is something that was, a story back in December. There was, there was panic stations. Newcastle going to be bringing Benzema to St James's Park. Mane is on his way, and all of this kind of stuff. Mitrovic, of course, former striker at Newcastle. Probably the one place where he didn't hit the back of the net on a regular basis, and probably down to a poor disciplinary record, and the fact that he didn't fit into Rafa's, probably his formation in the way that Rafa expected players to train, etc. But Mitrovic is an interesting one. I mean, is there a chance that Newcastle might visit the Saudi loan market for bringing a player in rather than putting a player out?
Well, I think people put two and two together and they say it would be easy, but it wouldn't, because you've got to be able to loan a player from Saudi on sky-high wages. So unless the Saudi club are prepared to split the wages with Newcastle or take on the burden, how are you going to do it? Even if it's only 6 months, there'll be a loan fee and there'll be wages. And just because Yasser Al-Rumayyan and PIF are Newcastle, it's different PIF people that run the clubs. And then you've got wider PIF, but you've also got to get ministry backing. And it's not a great look for the Saudi Pro League to have players come for 6 months and be loaned back. So I actually think it's harder for Newcastle, not easier. There's a natural narrative of Newcastle are going to benefit. Newcastle are going to get Neves. Well, they didn't. And there was never even an approach in the end. Newcastle are going to get Mitrovic. Newcastle are going to get Firmino. Wait and see how many they get, because I think the answer will be a big fat zero. And I think the reason for that is because the Ministry of Sport don't want the Saudi Pro League to be seen via the PIF controlled clubs as a filter to Newcastle. And Newcastle have got to be able to afford to contribute the wages, which is going to be really difficult unless the Saudi clubs are going to split them. And if they start splitting with Newcastle, that's not really a fair market value deal. So it's complicated. With Mitrovic specifically, I'm really surprised where these rumours are coming from, because I'm also seeing Mitrovic linked with Chelsea and others. Mitrovic, to my knowledge, is not one of these so-called unhappy players in Saudi Arabia. I think he's got 17 goals in 17 games in the Saudi Pro League. He's at the biggest club, fan base-wise and history-wise, in Saudi Arabia. Al Hilal are top of the league. They need goals because Neymar's obviously been injured and he was signed to be a source of goals, and they're still in the Asian Champions League. So why on earth would Aleksandar Mitrovic, on phenomenal money, scoring every week, going to likely win the league with Al Hilal and might well win the Asian Champions League as well with Al Hilal? Why logically would he entertain a move in the next 10 days when all suggestions are that he's happy in Saudi Arabia? And why would Al Hilal decide that they're going to sanction a loan move to the benefit of Newcastle and shoulder the wages when they want their best player? So you have to look at the Saudi project with loans as not PIF scratching PIF's back, but the Saudi project is bigger than Newcastle. So Newcastle are not some feeder club at the top of the pyramid that gobble up Saudi stars. It's the opposite. Keeping the stars in Saudi Arabia is far bigger than benefiting Newcastle, regardless of PIF talking to PIF. And as a consequence, you should look at this as, should a negotiation take place between Newcastle's PIF and the PIF people controlling the clubs. The thing people forget is the Ministry of Sport are in that room. And if senior people in the Ministry of Sport say no chance, it doesn't matter what Yasser Al-Rumayyan thinks. It doesn't matter what other PIF people think. You have to get the ministry approval. And I think that there is a 0.00001% chance that a Mitrovic exit would be sanctioned in the month of January.
Interesting. You mentioned Yasser because Ian McKenna had mentioned this earlier, and he says, "What's the scoop on Newcastle chairman facing a £58 million lawsuit for carrying out malicious instructions?" That was another story which broke this week, Ben.
Yeah, it's an interesting one only because naturally, regardless of anyone's perspective, and I appreciate that Newcastle fans will either say, what's it got to do with our club? Well, he is the chairman. Or why are people bashing Newcastle? Or why are people continuing to talk about Al-Rumayyan? I got a lot of stick when I was reporting on the Live Golf case where there was a little line saying that you basically can't prosecute Al-Rumayyan in this context, in the golf case, because he has diplomatic immunity because he's part of the government. And it's like, wait a minute, I thought there was this separation and he wasn't part of the government. So I understand why fans feel that constantly Al-Rumayyan and PIF are in the media and are bashed and are accused of doing things. And all I would say to that is we have a responsibility for this scrutiny. Nobody's ever explained what these legally binding assurances are, and they would have to be revisited, as with any director, by the way, if they are found guilty of any criminal charges or wrongdoing that would put them under a new scrutiny for the Premier League owners and directors test. So I think there's a few points here. One is how coordinated this is, because it becomes a big problem if it's PIF. If it is specific to Al-Rumayyan, then there may also be an issue with his directorship if he's found guilty. And we have to start with the premise of innocence and see how the case goes. But again, you could have an individual that does wrongdoing and deniability from PIF, and then a situation where it's fine for PIF, but Newcastle might have to look for a new chairman. So there's a range of moving parts. And again, things are always taken out of context in reporting because, see, then I've said Newcastle could have to look for a new chairman. Someone will take that and they'll headline that and they'll say, oh, Ben Jacobs said there might be a scenario where Newcastle have to look for a new chairman. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that any chairman at any football club, if they're criminally charged, would be in trouble as far as the Premier League owners and directors test, which continues after you come in. It's not one test and then that's that. There's continual due diligence. So this is interesting. And some of the charges are new and some of the allegations are not new. So, for example, we knew for a while that there was a subsuming of companies under PIF. And we knew that one of them was this private jet company. And we knew that that was allegedly used, according to papers that were released, as part of the logistical side of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So PIF have ownership of that company, and those private jets are obviously alleged to be involved in the operation that murdered Jamal Khashoggi. And now, in the context of that, Yasser Al-Rumayyan is facing this lawsuit for about 60 million for allegedly, keyword, having carried out instructions on behalf of the Crown Prince for malicious actions. And those malicious actions are obviously listed. We won't go into detail as to what they are. So the case has to play itself out. And in particular, these allegations come from a former Saudi intelligence chief who is the alleged target of these malicious actions. And at the same time, there are counter allegations from the Saudi side against the Saudi intelligence chief. So now we have to let the case play out and we have to presume innocence until guilty. We have to obviously cover the allegations, and if there is guilt and if there are criminal charges, as opposed to it just disappearing or being settled, then the Premier League will obviously have to access that and make a determination, as they would with any other executive or director at any other football club. So I think that, again, we revisit the situation of who is Yasser Al-Rumayyan and what is his role with Mohammed bin Salman. And is there this separation? And is there separation PIF to government? And obviously the Premier League argue yes. But a more interesting practical question is still, if Yasser Al-Rumayyan is a personal aide of Mohammed bin Salman, then they will have a personal relationship. So it's not just PIF and government, it's also AlRakan and bin Salman. And seemingly, as per these allegations, AlRakan is close enough to Mohammed bin Salman that Mohammed bin Salman can instruct him to do things, and AlRakan does them. Now, that doesn't mean that the actions undertaken are, as alleged, malicious. It doesn't mean that they are illegal. We have to wait and see. But the allegations in this case imply they are. But that's the interesting dynamic and the worrying dynamic for me, that you've got PIF and you've got government. And we have to accept at this point that the Premier League are satisfied because of these legally binding guarantees. I'd love them to show them and explain them. But regardless, we can argue that until we're blue in the face. The takeover's been approved. And for now, we have to move on from that. And we have to be balanced. And we have to say that if you've not seen them, you can't argue for or against them. You can just say the Premier League are satisfied. I can't say it's nonsense because I've not seen them. I can't say it's not nonsense because I've not seen them. I can just say the Premier League are satisfied. The takeover's been approved. We have to move on until further developments. If this case proves to be a further development, much like the Live Golf case, then the Premier League are going to have to look at that information and decide whether they're still happy with PIF and or Yasser Al-Rumayyan. But again, that is the same with every single owner. So where I maybe have sympathy, and maybe it's just because more information comes out around people that are connected to government, connected to PIF, or Yasser Al-Rumayyan is just individual with a lot of different projects. So it's normal more stuff would come out about him. So where I have sympathy is that nobody really scrutinized Leicester City's owners who had a relationship with the King of Thailand and King Power. And there were a few legal cases and fallings out over that. Nobody's putting as much scrutiny on Manchester City's ownership group, even though there's 115 charges. But the counterpoint to that is obviously those charges are ongoing and there's a hearing date set. So is there fallout from there? There is some scrutiny on the Reading owner who's not paying anybody, but he's still not being kicked out of the league. There was scrutiny on Thaksin Shinawat, who the league did kick out. So we have instances where others have been challenged, others have been in the media, but maybe Newcastle just feel that there's more headlines about them than any other club. And maybe that is just because Al-Rumayyan is more involved in different areas than most of our traditional owners. But what I would say is that as journalists, we absolutely have to put scrutiny on this. We can't just swallow things. We can't just assume that legally binding guarantees are legit indefinitely. And I think fans are the same. You want an owner that's transparent. So if these allegations emerge, then should there be substance to them, the Premier League should act. And if they go away, then the Premier League may be confident in their own position. But it's just important as media, if we're going to cover it, even though this is a very long answer that I'm giving, it's important as media, if we cover it, we try where possible and be balanced and give all sides. We don't just jump to the headline of, oh, he's under a lawsuit, he's being charged as being malicious, and therefore the whole position at Newcastle is under threat. There's a thing in the middle of that narrative, which is their allegations. Let's hear them out. Let's try and present all sides, and then let's see where it goes. And then only if allegations become charges, and only if charges become criminal punishments, only then would Newcastle and the Premier League likely get involved. Because in everything, it's not even just in football. The internal, as in within football, judicial process has to allow the external judicial process to see itself out first. My dad works in medicine, for example, and sometimes he sits on disciplinary commissions within medicine to determine punishments. But if the allegations extend beyond medicine, then he has to let whatever the charge is in a regular court case go first. And then only when they're concluded can they then decide what the knock-on effects are within the world of medicine. In other words, should the doctor be removed of his license? And it's the same here, that Newcastle and the Premier League can't really act until the wider cases against Al-Rumayyan run their course. Then when they've run their course and they've got a determination subject to any appeal, they have to decide whether it's relevant for them to act as well. And until they do so, we shouldn't really be in a position where we can draw any conclusions.
Okay, finishing off, big game for you this weekend, Ben. Leicester versus Ipswich. Time for Leicester to stand up and get 3 points and open a bigger gap.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, Leicester have just lost Cesar Casadei, who I don't know why a lot of Leicester fans are not that fussed about, but I really feel that he did okay. And they keep sort of wobbling a little bit in a game or two, but then recovering quite well. And their last game was a loss to Coventry. And let's hope that they respond, because back-to-back losses and you just start to get a little bit nervous. I think Leicester have been very strong at home, and all they really need to do now is win their home games and win, lose, draw away. And I think that will be enough to protect the gap. I'm not even that fussed if Ipswich won the league and Leicester finished second. It's just about going up. So it's a 10-point gap. But if you lose to Ipswich and Southampton win, you start to just get a little bit nervy. And maybe those that are not Leicester fans just look at it and say the nerviness is just natural fan perspective, but everyone else thinks that Leicester are going to go up at a canter. And hopefully that's true. The good thing for Leicester, like I say, is that their home form has been very solid. So I would expect them to get something from Ipswich, and as long as they don't lose, it's fine. And then I'd expect them to beat Swansea. And then again, if you lose away at Stoke, draw away at Watford, beat Sheffield Wednesday, you've still probably got a 6-7 point lead as far as automatic promotion is concerned, and we're already into February or early March. So I think Leicester will go up. I'm relatively confident. I think it's a shame that Cassidy departed back to Chelsea mid-season, and I believe that they can go and beat Ipswich. I think Leeds played Ipswich at home and they destroyed them 4-0, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if Leicester, off the back of that Coventry loss, put in a dominant performance. So I expect Leicester to beat Ipswich, and in doing so, it might open up a 13-point gap. So then this is where the fan perspective of swings always comes in. You know, fans are worried you're going to lose to Ipswich and they're going to get within 4 points, and then Southampton are going to win and Leeds are going to win, and it's all going to get a bit tighter. But I'm an optimist still. I think Leicester beat Ipswich, and then if Southampton fail to win their game away at Swansea, which is kicking off, I think, in about 20 minutes, then for all the worry or sort of slight panic, you've suddenly got a 13-point lead as far as automatic promotion is concerned. So I'm confident that Leicester will get promoted. And I also think they'll beat Ipswich, to be perfectly honest with you, in that home game.
Ben, as always, a wonderful hour. Passed very quickly. Thanks again, mate. Look forward to having you back on the show very soon. Take care. Have a great weekend. Good luck to Leicester.
Thanks very much. Have a good week, everyone.